It's great to be joined again today by Philippe Assouline, international relations expert. Philippe, I know that you, much like us, have been paying attention to many issues in the Middle East over the last week. Last Sunday, we had Vladimir Putin make comments about his desire to resist ISIS in the absence of directly saying that he is a supporter of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Immediately after that, Russia started airstrikes in Syria, which, according to a number of sources, seem to be targeting not ISIS, but actually opposition to Bashar al-Assad. Then we had the United Nations General Assembly, where both Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas gave speeches, both speeches receiving both praise and criticism from different factions, depending on where people stand with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. How can we sum up and sort of start to get a general sense of what is developing in the Middle East right now?
So thanks for having me, David. That's a great question. I would summarize it as mind the gap. There's a huge gap between what all these people have been saying and what's happening on the ground. President Obama was preaching almost an internationalism of cooperation and democratic values and international law. But in practice, he has been almost lethargic in assuming America's role in leading that, because without America's role in leading that charge, since the days of the League of Nations, which was an American idea, even though it wasn't implemented in America, America's been the leader in ensuring stability, the Pax Americana everybody talks about. Putin talked about the same things. He was also moralizing. He blamed the West for creating ISIS. He was saying there needs to be international law and large countries can't impose their will anymore, etc. And yet he's charging in roughshod into Syria using fighter jets to attack not just ISIS, or not even ISIS, as you're saying. It's not very clear how much of the bombing has been focused on ISIS. But we know there's been bombing on CIA-backed rebels, local nationalists. Abbas has taken a situation where there's been steady violence and incitement by Palestinian groups on the Temple Mount against Jewish worshippers and Jewish tourists, and turned that into a victim narrative where Israel is supposedly attacking the Temple Mount and wanting to destroy it to build the temple. It's a narrative that's been going on for 100 years, and every time it stokes violence. And Netanyahu, finally, if you'll just bear with me to finish, Netanyahu was talking a bit defiantly to Iran, saying, "You will not, your plans will not succeed. This deal will not stand. We will not sit idly by while Israel's destruction is being plotted, etc., etc." But in practice, what has he done? Very little. We've seen much more activity in terms of the American groups opposing it, and even that, has failed.
I want to get back to Putin and Syria and Obama, but let's stick for a second with the Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas speeches. In sort of analyzing the specifics of Mahmoud Abbas's speech, it was rife with untruths, half-truths, lies, distortions, etc. At the same time, and in watching Benjamin Netanyahu's speech and his opposition to the Iran deal, I'm increasingly, and as you know and our audience knows, I'm not a big fan of Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm particularly confused now that Benjamin Netanyahu seems to be taking an unpragmatic approach to the Iran deal, in the sense that, fine, I grant him that he maybe truly believes that it's not a good deal. I've interviewed the nuclear physicists. They've made it clear that based on the deal, there is going to be no surprise where all of a sudden Iran is close to having weapons-grade uranium, never mind a weapon. I've sort of talked to other analysts who agree that if you are in favor of a military solution in Iran, that's not really viable right now anyway, politically speaking, so that the deal does create a framework which, if violated, now can serve as a better pretext to do military action, right? If that is the direction you're going. I'm sort of wondering why Benjamin Netanyahu is continuing the rhetoric on the Iran deal when it seems clear that it's not going to be productive in terms of creating goodwill towards Israeli leadership.
It's a very good criticism. So the overwhelming majority of Israelis do not like this deal. They don't like the terms of the deal, and they don't believe even those terms will be followed. However, there's great criticism of Netanyahu for not accepting reality that Obama has won, this deal has passed, and now we need to try to salvage something to ensure Israel's security. And he's not doing that. I think you point to a very legitimate criticism. And I think what he's doing and what Netanyahu often does in his speeches is talk to his base. Right? Somebody once said there is no foreign policy in Israel, there's only domestic policy, and it's probably true of America as well to a large extent. He is talking to people who already agree with him and giving them emotional support, buttressing his base, whatever it is. There were not many new ideas at all, maybe a couple of new rhetorical flourishes on Netanyahu's part. Going back to Abbas, he was doing a karaoke of Arafat, really the most shameless and shameful of Palestinian demagoguery, using religion, creating a narrative of absolute victimhood. It boggles my mind that we're still dealing with a Palestinian leadership that says it wants self-determination, but acts like an absolute passive victim about everything. And as you said, with lies. To claim that Israel is trying to undermine the Al-Aqsa Mosque or the Temple Mount is an extremely, extremely dangerous lie. It has cost a number of Israeli lives already, which in turn will lead to military action, which will cost Palestinian lives. And Mahmoud Abbas, again, also is doing this for his domestic base. We always forget the Palestinians have their internal politics. There's ISIS arising in the Palestinian territories. There's Hamas trying to maintain relevancy. And Abbas is being more and more accused of corruption. $31 billion lost to the Palestinian Authority with nothing to show except that he's building himself a palace. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why he's using Al-Aqsa to deflect attention. It's been done many times in the past.
One of the saddest things to me in hearing the rhetoric around what's been going on in the Temple Mount and the Al-Aqsa Mosque is that too many people don't know the history of that very small area within the old city of Jerusalem, which is that during the time when Israel did not have sovereignty over the Jewish quarter was vandalized and damaged and destroyed, and historic structures were absolutely demolished. Immediately, when Israel gained control and sovereignty over that area, they immediately turned back over administrative control of the Temple Mount to the Palestinians. That is not something that they had to do. It is something that they chose to do. And that just empirical history seems to never be mentioned in most reporting around what takes place there.
Well, sadly, you're absolutely right. And sadly, none of the history really is well known. This conflict is reduced to gimmicks. There is a tendency on the side of people who are opposed to Israel or hostile to Israel to use emotionally manipulative trigger words, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, genocide, none of which apply to the facts, but they cause an emotional reaction to people that makes it very hard to get past that and look at the facts. The Temple Mount, as you said, has a long history with Israel. It is the holiest site in Judaism for 3,000 years. It is a holy site for Christianity, and it is now a holy site for Islam for the last 13 centuries, more or less. The entire Jewish quarter wasn't just vandalized, it was destroyed by the Jordanians who invaded and occupied from 1948 to 1967. They built latrines out of tombstones, and I can go on with the details. Today, the only people who have freedom of worship on the Temple Mount are Muslims, because the Muslim authorities on the Mount, the Waqf, will not let Christians or Jews even murmur prayers. And that is where a big part of the tension is coming from.
Let's go now, in the last few minutes we have, back to Syria and Vladimir Putin. One of the dichotomies that I'm seeing, which I believe is a false dichotomy, is one where, on the one hand, Vladimir Putin says that, hey, listen, all of those opposition groups are terrorists, and maybe the Syrians would actually be better off under Bashar al-Assad. Where, on the other hand, we had President Obama on Friday in his press conference say, the idea that the moderate rebels are all terrorists is ridiculous. And it seems that we need to have more of a nuanced view here, which is, there's a conversation to be had as to whether it's better for the Syrian people to have one or another group in power. But at the same time, Philippe, the U.S. has a very long history of arming groups that we determine in the short or medium term to be so-called moderates or better than the alternative. And ultimately, these experiments totally backfire on the U.S., ending up with our own weapons turned against us or whoever we're ultimately supporting. And that reality is sort of missing from the Putin-Obama back and forth.
Absolutely. So in general, I agree with President Obama. I don't think it's a surprise. He's saying the local nationalists are our best hope for ending this war and for moving on. President Putin made the exact criticism you did. He said, you're giving them weapons, they're moving hands, these people are mercenaries in large part, and you're going to end up arming terrorists, which are going to turn against you, and you've done it in the past. And he pointed to Libya and Iraq, where America destabilized tyrants, but tyrants who were maintaining order. The problem with Assad is that you have a sectarian element here. And the only way Russia is going to maintain its interests in Syria, which is not to fight ISIS, the Russian interests are to project power and to maintain a second avenue of gas delivery to Europe. The only way they're going to maintain the Assad regime there is through massacring the Sunni rebels and crushing the Sunni majority. The majority of the population is Sunni. They do not want Assad. Assad is not a legitimate government. On the American side, I think maybe that's why there was a reticence to get very involved. But this is the criticism I have of Obama, is like he's making the right points. He's saying the right things. But what is America doing? The fact that Russia feels comfortable enough to come in and change the equation, and again, to install or to ensure that Assad stays in power, it will have to commit massacres or have a very, very hard hand on the people there. The only way Russia is able to come in and do that is because America stopped projecting power. I tend to believe that there must have been some kind of tacit agreement for the Russians to come in and try to solve the problem. Maybe Obama believes they're going to get bogged down and suffer. But in the meantime, the Syrian people are going to keep suffering.
But Philippe,
neither side is going to accept a compromise.
Is it the responsibility of the U.S. to get involved? I mean, this is a conversation we've had, which is, yes, the decisions of George W. Bush did create a vacuum in which ISIS formed. But how far does President Obama continue to be responsible for that? And I don't know the answer.
I don't think it's a question of responsibility. It's a question that comes up over and over again. I don't think America is morally responsible for what happens in the Arab world at all. I think, if anything, we've coddled the Arab world too much. We're taking care of Palestinian refugees for 67 years. Now the entire focus on the Syrian refugees, rather than solving the Syria crisis, is on Europe. Rather than asking Arab countries to take care of the refugees, is on Europe. For me, it's not a question of responsibility. The responsibility is with the local actors. It's a question of strategic interest. America has a policy for 70 years of keeping the Russians out of the Middle East. Now, they failed for a long time under communism, but now it's so overt that changes the dynamic, right? The refugee issue is also a strategic issue. When you have millions of people fleeing an area to Europe and then the United States, that is also a strategic interest, etc. The rise of extremism, terrorist bases. The US has a strategic interest in doing something there for its own good. I don't think Russia doubling its means of supply of gas to Europe, having access to the huge Mediterranean gas basin, and thus becoming empowered and sidestepping sanctions from Ukraine, is in America's strategic interest. I don't think Russia empowering Iran to have a bridge to Hezbollah is in America's strategic interest, etc. So it's more a question of what America needs to do for itself than what it is responsible for.
Many factors and significant complexity, and we're going to continue following all elements of this. We've been speaking with Philippe Assouline, international relations expert. Philippe, great to talk to you as always.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me.